Hello guys, tonight we're going back to Victorian England. Before we dive into this world of secrets and history, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel, but only if you really enjoy our travels together. Beneath the flicker of gaslight and the constant hum of carriages, Victorian London was a city of striking contrasts. Splendor and squalor stood side by side, glittering parlors where aristocrats sipped tea and whispered political secrets, and shadowy alleys where the desperate fought for survival. This was an age of reformers and revolutionaries, of choking smog and groundbreaking discoveries, of lives lived on the knife's edge between fortune and despair. Shadows of Victorian London, crime, class, and survival in the 19th century takes you deep into the heart of that world. From the terror of Jack the Ripper's Whitechapel to the foul reek of the Great Stink. From the weary climb of the child chimney sweep to the quiet heroism of Florence Nightingale. These stories reveal the struggles, scandals, and small triumphs of a society wrestling with its own conscience. Here, in the grime and grandeur of the 19th century, we glimpse the raw humanity that shaped the modern age. The year was 1888. In the heart of London, the East End lay shrouded in smoke, fog, and the dim glow of gas lamps. Whitechapel was a district of crowded lodging houses, narrow alleys, and grim poverty. The streets were alive at night, not with wealth and comfort, but with desperation. Dock workers, costermongers, pickpockets, and women forced into prostitution by hunger moved through the darkness. It was here, in these gaslit streets, that a shadow emerged, a figure who would become the most infamous killer in history, Jack the Ripper. Whitechapel was unlike the grand boulevards of West London. Here, narrow courts branched off from main roads like veins. Buildings leaned inward, their bricks blackened with soot. Lodging houses crammed 20 or 30 people into a single room. The gas lamps along Whitechapel Road gave off a weak, flickering glow, creating more shadow than light. At night, the air was heavy with coal smoke and the smell of cheap gin from the pubs. To many middle-class Londoners, the East End was a world apart, a place of crime and vice, spoken of in tones of fear. Journalists often described it as a jungle of humanity, a place beyond law and order. And yet, thousands lived there, trying to survive each day. In the late summer of 1888, the unease of Whitechapel turned into terror. Women who lived on the margins of society, Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly, became the Ripper's victims. Their bodies were found in the early hours, mutilated in ways that shocked even hardened police officers. The murders revealed the vulnerability of women, forced to walk the streets at night for survival. They also exposed the inability of Victorian law enforcement to control the dark corners of the city. Constables patrolled the streets, but the killer always struck and vanished, leaving behind only silence and fear. The gas lamps became a symbol of dread. Their pale light barely reached into alleys, and their flickering made shadows dance like phantoms. To walk alone at night was to gamble with death. Lodging house keepers locked doors earlier. Prostitutes huddled together for safety, yet still had to venture out, for hunger was as deadly as the Ripper. Residents reported footsteps behind them, the scrape of boots on cobblestones, a figure vanishing just out of sight. Every stranger became a suspect. Every shadow seemed to conceal the Ripper. If the murders themselves filled Whitechapel with fear, the newspapers spread that fear across the entire nation. Victorian journalism thrived on sensationalism, and Jack the Ripper's crimes provided the perfect storm. Bold headlines screamed from the front pages: "Ghastly murder in Whitechapel," and "Another horrible outrage." Illustrations showed gaslit alleys, dark figures, and terrified women. Readers devoured every detail, from the positions of the bodies to the supposed surgical skill of the killer. The press invented nicknames: the Whitechapel Fiend, the Leather Apron, before finally settling on the chilling name that would endure: Jack the Ripper. In September 1888, letters arrived at police stations and news offices, allegedly from the killer himself. Written in red ink, some mocked the police, others promised more murders. Whether real or hoaxes, the letters were printed in newspapers, feeding the public's obsession. For the first time in history, a serial killer became a media sensation. The Ripper murders did more than terrify. They highlighted the stark divide between rich and poor in Victorian London. While the West End enjoyed glittering theaters and fashionable gaslit streets, the East End remained a world of darkness, overcrowding, and crime. Politicians faced pressure to address poverty, sanitation, and policing. In Whitechapel, life became unbearable. Women feared venturing out, men were suspected by neighbors, and police were met with scorn. Detectives worked tirelessly, but the Ripper always seemed one step ahead. Each new murder deepened the panic and the mystery. By the end of 1888, the killings stopped as suddenly as they had begun. The Ripper vanished into history. His identity never revealed, but the impact lingered. Whitechapel was no longer just another poor district. It had become a place synonymous with horror. The gaslit streets, once ordinary, were now haunted by memory. Newspapers had transformed the Ripper into a household name, a figure whose legend would outlast his crimes. The fear in Whitechapel became part of London's story, echoing through novels, plays, films, and endless speculation. Jack the Ripper's London was a city of contrasts. Gas lamps glowing on wet cobblestones, wealth and poverty side by side, order and chaos coexisting uneasily. The terror in Whitechapel was not only about a murderer in the shadows, but also about what he revealed. A city where thousands lived in conditions so desperate that the appearance of a phantom killer seemed almost inevitable. And in the end, it was not just the women of Whitechapel who were stalked by fear. It was London itself, trapped between light and shadow, its streets forever changed by the ghostly figure who walked unseen beneath the flickering gas lamps. The summer of 1858 was unusually hot in London. The air hung heavy over the sprawling city, and as the temperature rose, so too did a smell, a stench so overpowering that it brought the capital of the British Empire to its knees. This was no ordinary foul odor. It was the Great Stink, the moment when the River Thames, London's lifeline, became a reeking cesspool that could no longer be ignored. For centuries, The Thames had been London's heart. Its waters carried ships from across the world, brought food into the city, and served as a highway of commerce. But as London expanded in the 18th and 19th centuries, the river became something else, a dumping ground. By the 1850s, London was the largest city in the world, with over 2 million inhabitants. Yet its sanitation was medieval. Human waste from homes and cesspits flowed into open drains and eventually into the Thames. Tanneries, slaughterhouses, breweries, and factories all emptied their refuse directly into the river. Dead animals, rotting food, and industrial byproducts mixed with raw sewage. For years, the problem was ignored or tolerated. After all, the Thames always flowed, and many believed the water would cleanse itself. But as the population grew, the river became little more than an open sewer. The filth of the Thames was not merely unpleasant, it was deadly. London suffered repeated outbreaks of cholera in 1832, 1848, 1854, and again in 1857. Thousands died in each epidemic. At the time, most doctors believed in the miasma theory, the idea that disease was spread through foul air, not contaminated water. In 1854, Dr. John Snow had proved that cholera spread through water, tracing an outbreak to a contaminated pump in Soho. But his findings were dismissed by many officials. As far as most were concerned, the river was foul but not fatal, just another unpleasant fact of urban life. That belief would not last the summer of 1858. The heat wave of June and July baked London under relentless sun. As the river shrank and slowed, its banks oozed with black mud and floating waste. Gas from decaying sewage bubbled to the surface. The stench rolled across bridges, seeped into homes, and clung to clothing. Newspapers described the smell in colorful detail, a fetid, nauseous compound of all that is most disgusting. Ordinary Londoners held handkerchiefs soaked in vinegar or pressed flowers to their noses. Clerks along the river covered windows with sheets soaked in lime chloride. But the worst affected was the very heart of government. The Palace of Westminster, Parliament itself, sat directly on the banks of the Thames. The lawmakers of the empire could hardly sit in their chambers. The smell invaded through every window and corridor. One member of Parliament described it as a Stygian pool, reeking with ineffable and unbearable horror. Curtains were soaked with chemicals to try to block the odor, but nothing worked. The Thames had become impossible to ignore. By July, Parliament was in crisis. Some members demanded the House be moved entirely to another location. Others feared that the stench would carry pestilence straight into the lungs of the nation's rulers. For the first time, those who had long ignored the plight of London's poor were personally affected. The panic forced action. Within weeks, a bill was rushed through Parliament to fund a massive new sewer system for London. It was one of the fastest acts of legislation in the Victorian era, passed not out of compassion for the suffering poor, but out of desperation to save Parliament itself from the unbearable smell. The man chosen to solve the crisis was Joseph Bazalgette, a brilliant civil engineer. Bazalgette had already been campaigning for years for a proper sewer system, but only now did the government agree to finance his plan. He designed a vast network of brick sewers, many large enough for a man to walk through. These underground tunnels collected waste from the city and carried it eastward, far beyond central London, where it could be discharged into the Thames with the tides. It was a project of unprecedented scale. 82 miles of main sewers, 1,100 miles of smaller drains, and massive pumping stations. Built with extraordinary craftsmanship, Bazalgette's sewers were over-engineered to handle future growth, a decision that means many are still in use today. The Great Stink lasted only a summer, but its impact was permanent. Bazalgette's sewers transformed London into a modern city. The epidemics of cholera ended, and the Thames, though never entirely clean, ceased to be a deadly open sewer. The event also changed public health policy. For the first time, the government recognized sanitation as a central duty, not merely for the poor, but for the survival of the entire city. The Great Stink was, in effect, the moment when London realized that public health was inseparable from progress. The story of the Great Stink is more than just a tale of foul odors. It is the story of how a city, at the height of empire, was brought to its knees not by foreign enemies, but by its own filth. It is the story of how fear and disgust, more than compassion or science, drove lawmakers to act. And it is the story of how a single unbearable summer reshaped the future of London, leaving behind not only the memory of the stink, but also the great Victorian sewers that remain one of the unsung wonders of the modern world. Imagine waking before dawn in a city where coal smoke hangs heavy in the air. The streets are still wet from the night's rain. The lamps are just being extinguished, and you, a child no older than 8 or 9, are shaken awake by a gruff master. There is no breakfast waiting. Instead, he thrusts a soot-blackened brush and a sack into your small hands. Today, like every day, you will crawl into the chimneys of Victorian London. You wouldn't last a day. Few did without scars, or worse. In the 18th and early 19th centuries, Britain's appetite for coal was insatiable. Every home, from grand mansions to cramped cottages, had multiple fireplaces. Each needed regular cleaning, or the soot would clog the flues and spark deadly fires. The work fell to chimney sweeps. But here was the problem. Many chimneys were narrow, no wider than 9 inches across, and twisted with awkward bends. Only small bodies could squeeze inside. That meant children, mostly orphans, paupers, or the sons of the desperate poor, were apprenticed to master sweeps. Apprenticeship in this case was little more than legalized servitude. The day's work began with the climb. A chimney mouth yawned darkly before you, its soot-smudged bricks slick to the touch. The master barked for you to get inside. You wriggled in head first, arms pressed to your sides, legs straining for purchase against the walls. Every breath filled your lungs with soot. Your eyes watered and burned. The air inside the flue was hot, still, and suffocating. Inch by inch, you forced yourself upward, scraping your skin raw on rough brick. Sometimes you became stuck, wedged in a bend where the chimney narrowed. A panicked kick might free you, or it might not. There were cases where children suffocated, their bodies later dragged out limp and blackened. Even if you reached the top, the reward was only more climbing. Most households had multiple fireplaces, each one connected to its own flue. You would crawl through a labyrinth of smoke-black tunnels until every surface had been scraped clean. The toll on the body was terrible. Soot filled your lungs, bringing on a constant cough. Many sweeps suffered soot wart, a form of cancer of the scrotum caused by constant exposure to coal tar, the first industrial cancer ever identified. Skin diseases, eye infections, and chronic lung illness were all common. Your knees and elbows became raw from crawling. Often, masters gave you nothing but rags to wear, or even sent you up naked, so your clothes wouldn't snag on the chimney walls. Cold mornings left you shivering before a hot climb seared your skin. There was no rest, no comfort, just one flue after another. The master sweep was supposed to be a teacher. In reality, many were cruel taskmasters. If a child hesitated to enter a chimney, some masters lit a small fire at the grate, a cruel practice known as smoking them out. The rising smoke forced the child to scramble upward or suffocate. Food was scarce. Apprentices often lived on scraps of bread and broth, sleeping in basements alongside ags of soot. The master made his living from the children's labor, and compassion was rare. And if you thought running away was an option, think again. A child on the streets of Victorian London, without protection or food, was as good as lost. By the time the day ended, your face was unrecognizable, black with soot, except for two pale rings around your eyes where tears had carved clean paths. Exhausted, you returned to your master's lodging. You might eat, or you might be sent to bed hungry. Tomorrow would bring more chimneys, more suffocation, more coughing fits. Children sometimes fell asleep still coated in soot, their skin never properly washed. The soot, ground into every pore, became part of them. Many chimney sweeps never grew to old age. Those who did carried lifelong scars in their lungs, on their skin, and in their bones. By the early 19th century, the public began to take notice. Reformers and doctors exposed the cruelty of child chimney sweeps. Legislation was passed to forbid the use of children in the trade, but it was ignored for years. Only with the invention of mechanical brushes and growing pressure from humanitarian groups did the practice finally begin to fade. By the mid-19th century, the image of the child sweep had become both a symbol of Victorian cruelty and a rallying point for reform. But for tens of thousands of children, the change came too late. To imagine yourself in the shoes or bare feet of a chimney sweep is to confront the harshest realities of industrial society. Cramped chimneys, suffocating soot, the lash of a cruel master, and the slow ruin of health were daily companions. You wouldn't last a day because the work was designed for those with no choice. The abandoned, the orphaned, the desperately poor. They endured it not out of strength, but out of necessity, trapped in a system that profited from their suffering. And that is why the story of the chimney sweep still lingers in our imagination, a reminder that behind the soot and smoke of industrial progress were children crawling through darkness, sacrificing their lives to keep the fires of London burning. On a warm spring day in 1820, in the Italian city of Florence, a child was born to wealthy British parents. They named her after the city of her birth, Florence Nightingale. No one could have guessed that this girl, raised in privilege and refinement, would one day walk the blood-soaked wards of military hospitals and change the very meaning of nursing. Her life was curious, not because she was born to high society, but because she turned her back on it. Florence's early years were spent not in hardship, but in comfort. Her father, William Nightingale, was a wealthy landowner, educated at Cambridge, with a keen interest in philosophy, science, and literature. Florence and her older sister, Parthenope, grew up surrounded by books, tutors, and the genteel expectations of the English upper class. As a young woman, Florence was expected to marry well, attend parties, and preside over a fine household. But she was restless. She found drawing rooms and polite conversations stifling. More than once, she confided in her journals a sense of being called to a greater purpose. At the age of 17, she even wrote that God had spoken to her, commanding her to dedicate her life to service. The idea horrified her family. Nursing in early Victorian England was not a profession for ladies. Nurses were often poor, untrained, even drunk. For a young woman of Florence's class, to pursue nursing was considered scandalous. But Florence was not one to be easily swayed. Throughout her 20s, Florence studied medicine and nursing in secret, reading medical reports and statistics. In 1844, she began visiting hospitals and workhouses, where the conditions shocked her. Dirty wards, careless treatment, and suffering ignored. She sought formal training, and despite her family's objections, traveled to Germany to study at a Protestant hospital in Kaiserswerth. There, she learned the basics of nursing: discipline, cleanliness, and compassion. It was a turning point. When she returned to England, Florence began to carve out a reputation as a reformer. She became superintendent of a London hospital for gentlewomen, where her efficiency and strict standards impressed even her critics. Still, her true test was yet to come. In 1854, war erupted in Crimea between Russia and an alliance of Britain, France, and the Ottoman Empire. Reports soon reached London of appalling conditions in the British field hospitals. Soldiers who survived battle often died of disease, infection, and neglect. When the Minister of War, Sidney Herbert, a friend of Florence, asked for her help, she seized the opportunity. Accompanied by a team of nurses, she traveled to the military hospital at Scutari, near Constantinople. What she found was worse than anyone had imagined. The hospital was overcrowded, filthy, and infested with vermin. Wounded men lay on bare floors without blankets. Supplies were scarce, and sanitation was almost non-existent. Diseases like cholera and typhus killed far more soldiers than Russian bullets. Florence set to work immediately. She demanded proper sanitation, organized laundry services, improved ventilation, and secured clean bandages and fresh food. She brought discipline and compassion to a place of despair. At night, she walked the wards with a lamp in her hand, checking on the wounded. The soldiers began to call her the lady with the lamp. To men who had thought themselves forgotten, her presence was a symbol of care and hope. Yet Florence was not only a nurse with a lamp. She was a scientist at heart, with a talent for mathematics and statistics. She meticulously recorded death rates, causes of disease, and the impact of her reforms. The numbers were startling. Before her changes, soldiers in Scutari died at a rate higher than those fighting at the front. After sanitation was introduced, the death rate plummeted. She returned to England with evidence, not just compassion, but proof that hygiene and organization saved lives. Her use of data was groundbreaking. She pioneered visual statistics, creating charts and diagrams that showed, in striking clarity, how disease killed more soldiers than combat. These diagrams persuaded politicians and the public alike. When she returned to England, Florence was a national heroine. Newspapers praised her, poems were written about her, and her name became synonymous with nursing. Yet, she shunned the spotlight. Fame meant little to her. Reform meant everything. She continued to push for better sanitation, not only in military hospitals, but in civilian ones as well. She advised on hospital design, campaigned for public health reform in India, and established a nursing school at St. Thomas's Hospital in London in 1860. Her school trained generations of nurses, raising the profession from disrepute to respect. The later years of Florence's life were marked by ill health. She suffered from chronic pain and fatigue, perhaps from brucellosis contracted during the war. Despite this, she continued to write, advise, and reform from her sickbed. She lived long enough to see her work transform nursing into a respected career. When she died in 1910, at the age of 90, the world mourned. Though offered burial in Westminster Abbey, she requested a quiet grave in Hampshire. Her epitaph was simple, her legacy enormous. Florence Nightingale's life was curious because it defied the path laid out for her. Born into privilege, she chose service. Expected to be a hostess in drawing rooms, she became a reformer in hospitals. Where others saw duty to society, she saw duty to humanity. The lady with the lamp walked through the darkest wards of war, carrying not only a light in her hand, but also the illumination of science, compassion, and reform. She proved that care was not weakness, that numbers could be weapons, and that one woman's defiance could change the fate of countless lives. Picture London in the late 19th century. The carriages clatter along cobblestone streets, footmen in livery stand to attention at townhouses in Belgravia and Mayfair, and the scent of coal smoke mixes with that of fresh horse manure. Inside one of these grand homes, however, the world is very different. It is warm, perfumed, and hushed. The hour is 4 o'clock. It is time for afternoon tea. For the British aristocracy, tea was never just about refreshment. It was a performance, one woven with etiquette, corseted elegance, and whispers of politics that mattered as much as anything spoken in the House of Commons. The drawing room where tea was served was often designed to impress. Tall windows admitted soft daylight, filtered through lace curtains. Chairs upholstered in silk or damask were arranged in small conversational circles. At the center stood a low table, laid with a linen cloth, on which rested the polished silver tea service and fine china, perhaps from Meissen, Sèvres, or Wedgwood, depending on the hostess's wealth and taste. The ladies arrived dressed in tightly laced corsets, their gowns rustling with taffeta and trimmed with lace. Gloves were worn until tea was served. The gentlemen, if present, were equally constrained, not by whalebone and lace, but by stiff collars and coats that made every gesture deliberate. The air was thick with unspoken rules. The ritual was governed by codes as intricate as the patterns on the porcelain cups. The hostess poured the tea herself, for to delegate this role to a servant was considered impolite. She would ask, 1 lump or 2, as she spooned sugar into delicate cups, and only she decided the pace of the service. Milk was poured after the tea, never before, at least among the aristocracy. This milk after rule signaled refinement, for only the finest porcelain could withstand the heat of boiling liquid without cracking. The less wealthy, whose pottery was more fragile, were forced to pour milk first. Thus, the sequence became a social marker. Cups were held by the handle, with pinky fingers discreetly curled inward, contrary to the popular caricature. Saucers were lifted only when standing. When seated, the saucer remained on the table. Sandwiches and cakes were taken with fingers, never with forks. Every gesture mattered, for etiquette was not simply about manners. It was a language of status. Beneath the calm ritual lay the physical strain of appearance. Ladies sat upright, their corsets cinching waists into fashionable silhouettes, but also restricting breath. To lean or slouch was unthinkable. Conversation was carried on in controlled tones, smiles held in place, even as the stays beneath their gowns pressed ribs and lungs. The very discomfort of the attire was a signal of refinement. It declared that these women did not labor, that their hands were soft and uncalloused, that they had the luxury of time to sit in rigid elegance over cups of Darjeeling or Earl Grey. The tea table was a stage, and corsets were part of the costume. Yet behind the delicate clink of porcelain and the polite small talk, something more serious brewed. Afternoon tea was a social instrument where alliances were formed, reputations made or destroyed, and news circulated faster than in the newspapers. A duchess might whisper to her neighbor about the latest scandal in Parliament. A viscountess might pass on a rumor about a rival family's debts. Young women, meanwhile, were carefully observed, their manners, gowns, and charm weighed by potential suitors' mothers. The drawing room could be as political as the Commons, though the weapons here were wit, reputation, and subtle exclusion. An ill-chosen remark, a breach of etiquette, or a show of vulgarity might mean fewer invitations in the future. Conversely, a charming anecdote delivered with grace could open doors to powerful connections. In this way, afternoon tea was both harmless and dangerous, a seemingly innocent ritual that carried enormous social weight. The tea consumed at such gatherings was itself a marker of status. By the 19th century, Britain's empire ensured a steady supply of teas from India and Ceylon. Darjeeling, known as the champagne of teas, was particularly prized. Served in fine porcelain, accompanied by thin slices of lemon or fresh cream, tea was transformed from an imported commodity into a cultural cornerstone. The accompaniments were equally refined. Finger sandwiches with cucumber or smoked salmon, scones with clotted cream and jam, delicate pastries, and sponge cakes. To serve too little was an embarrassment. To serve too much was considered gauche. Balance was key, just as in conversation. To sit at the tea table with the aristocracy was to enter a world where everything, from how you held your cup, to the tightness of your corset, to the sharpness of your gossip, signaled who you were and how you would be remembered. It was a place where politics mingled with pastry, where corsets masked discomfort behind poise, and where the fine china bore witness to whispered confidences that could ripple outward into the wider world of power and influence. Tea with the aristocracy was never just refreshment. It was performance, strategy, and spectacle, all contained in the delicate clink of a cup against its saucer. In the summer of 1888, the East End of London was choking with heat, soot, and poverty. Rows of tenements sagged under the weight of too many families crammed into single rooms. Children played barefoot in alleyways, while their mothers worked long hours in factories, and their fathers, if they had work at all, labored in the docks. Amid this backdrop of hunger and hardship stood the sprawling red brick factory of Bryant and May, the most famous match manufacturer in Britain. Inside, hundreds of women and girls, some as young as 13, spent their days dipping wooden splints into a yellowish paste, white phosphorus. The air was acrid, heavy with fumes, and it clung to their hair and skin. A grim joke among the workers was that they glowed faintly in the dark after a long shift. But the glow was no blessing. It was a poison. The dangers of white phosphorus were well known by the 1880s. Prolonged exposure caused a horrific disease known as phossy jaw. At first, it seemed like nothing more than a toothache, but then the gums swelled, abscesses burst, and the jawbone itself began to rot. The smell of decaying bone was unmistakable, and once the condition set in, doctors often removed the jaw to save the patient's life. Many did not survive at all. For the match girls, there was little choice. The wages were meager, a few shillings a week, but it was more than many could hope for in the East End. They worked 12 to 14 hours a day, fined for the smallest infractions, talking too much, dropping matches, or arriving late. They were required to pay for the cost of broken tools or spoiled materials, and often had wages docked without explanation. But behind their youthful faces and weary eyes, a storm was brewing. The spark came not from within the factory walls, but from the outside. Annie Besant, a well-known social reformer, wrote an article in her newspaper, The Link, exposing the conditions of the Bryant and May workers. She described the long hours, the starvation wages, and above all, the silent plague of phosphorus poisoning. The factory owners were furious. They pressured the workers to sign statements denying the allegations, but the match girls refused. They had had enough. On July 5th, 1888, about 1,400 women walked out of Bryant and May's factory in protest. For London, the sight was shocking. Poor, uneducated young women, often dismissed as powerless, had taken a stand. Crowds gathered to watch as the match girls, in their worn dresses and aprons, marched together. The East End, usually voiceless in the politics of the day, suddenly found itself at the center of a labor revolt. The strike spread quickly. Meetings were held in the East End, with fiery speeches delivered by both the workers and their allies. Annie Besant, threw her full support behind them, helping to organize strike funds and draw the attention of the national press. The girls demanded an end to unfair fines, better wages, and safer conditions. They wanted the use of white phosphorus abolished, replaced with the less toxic red phosphorus already used in parts of Europe. For the first time, their voices were heard in Parliament, where sympathetic MPs raised questions about factory conditions. Newspapers that once ignored the plight of the East End now published daily reports on the strike. Public opinion began to shift in favor of the workers, and Bryant and May, once untouchable, found itself under intense scrutiny. After just 3 weeks, the Match Girls won a significant victory. The company agreed to abolish unfair fines and improve working conditions. It was not the complete triumph they dreamed of. White phosphorus would not be fully banned in Britain until 1910, but it was a breakthrough. For the first time, a group of unskilled female workers had forced one of the most powerful companies in the country to the bargaining table. The strike inspired more than just factory reforms. It marked a turning point in the history of labor rights. Within months, the Match Girls Union was formed, one of the first trade unions in Britain, led by women. Their courage helped pave the way for the great wave of union organizing that followed, influencing dock workers, gas workers, and countless others across the country. The Match Girls were not trained activists, nor were they politicians. They were ordinary young women, many illiterate, who worked themselves to exhaustion in exchange for wages that barely kept hunger at bay. Yet, in July 1888, they became something extraordinary, a collective force that challenged exploitation and demanded dignity. The streets of Whitechapel, usually associated with crime and despair, became the birthplace of a new chapter in British labor history. And while the smell of phosphorus and poverty lingered for years, the strike proved that even the most marginalized could resist and sometimes win. The Match Girls lit more than matches. They lit the flame of labor rights. The Industrial Revolution transformed Britain in the 18th and 19th centuries, painting the landscape with smoking chimneys, roaring steam engines, and vast brick mills that loomed over once quiet villages. But inside those mills, particularly the textile factories that powered the empire, was another world entirely. One of clattering machines, choking dust, and children at work before they could even read or write. For factory owners, children were a perfect workforce. Their small, nimble fingers could dart into places adults could not reach. They were fast, cheap, and, most importantly, plentiful. Families struggling with poverty often saw no choice but to send their sons and daughters to the mills. Inside, the children's tasks were as dangerous as they were exhausting. Some worked as piecers, crawling beneath the great spinning machines to tie broken threads while the cogs still turned above their heads. Others were doffers, pulling heavy bobbins from whirring frames, their hands a blur. The work began before dawn. In the dim light of early morning, children trudged to the mill. Breakfast, often nothing more than a crust of bread. By 6 o'clock, the machines thundered to life, drowning out thought, conversation, even the sound of their own cries. For 12 to 14 hours, The air rang with a deafening mechanical roar. The spinning and weaving rooms were suffocating. Cotton fibers filled the air like fog, coating the lungs of every child and worker. Many developed chronic coughs or mill fever, a persistent illness that gnawed at their strength. Others suffered gradual hearing loss, the machines so loud they left ears ringing long after the day's work was done. Accidents were common. A slip of the hand, a moment of fatigue, and fingers were caught, crushed, or severed by the relentless machinery. Children who worked close to the looms often bore scars or missing digits for life. And because many were barefoot, shoes being a luxury, their feet were vulnerable to splinters, nails, or even the iron tread of a passing wheel. Yet for all this, the wages were pitiful. A child might earn just a shilling a week, barely enough to buy food for a day. Factory owners justified it by claiming they were teaching discipline and keeping idle children from crime. The mills were ruled by overseers with sticks and whips. A child who nodded off from exhaustion might be beaten awake. One who faltered in speed could have their pay docked. Late arrivals were sometimes forced to work unpaid hours as punishment. In some factories, children who arrived with dirty faces were made to wash in front of the others, a public shaming meant to enforce discipline. In others, fines were levied for the smallest mistakes, a dropped bobbin, a knot tied poorly. The result was a system that combined relentless labor with constant fear, a childhood not of play, but of survival. But outside the walls of the mills, whispers of change were stirring. Writers, doctors, and reformers began to expose the brutal conditions endured by child laborers. Reports to Parliament revealed the shocking reality. Children as young as 5 or 6 working 14-hour shifts, falling asleep at their machines, or crippled by accidents before their teenage years. Campaigners like Lord Ashley, later the Earl of Shaftesbury, and reforming factory inspectors brought the plight of these children into the public eye. They published testimony that horrified Victorian society. Little girls with curved spines from stooping all day, boys coughing up blood from cotton dust, families burying their children before they turned 12. Their efforts led to the Factory Acts, a series of laws passed throughout the 19th century. The early acts were weak, often poorly enforced, but each one chipped away at the system. Hours for children were gradually reduced, night work restricted, and schooling made compulsory. Change did not come overnight. Even after reforms were written into law, many mill owners resisted, claiming poverty without child labor would ruin them. Inspectors were few, and enforcement was patchy. But the tide was turning. By the late 19th century, child labor in its most brutal form was slowly dying out in Britain, replaced by compulsory education and stricter protections. The sound of children laughing in schoolyards began to replace the image of them coughing in spinning rooms. The story of the mill children is both tragic and heroic. Tragic because so many lives were broken or lost to the hunger of machines. Heroic because their suffering fueled a reform movement that changed the very nature of work and childhood. Their tiny hands turned the wheels of an empire. Their tired eyes saw the birth of modern industry, and their cries, once muffled by the roar of looms, echoed loudly enough to awaken a nation's conscience. Today, the textile mills stand silent or turned into museums, their bricks red against the sky. But if you listen carefully, you can almost hear the hum of machines and the patter of small bare feet on wooden floors. A reminder of the children whose stolen childhoods forced the world to rethink what labor should mean. The workhouse was one of the most feared institutions of 19th century Britain. It was meant to be a refuge for the destitute, but in reality, it was a place of last resort, where the price of shelter was often the loss of freedom, family, and dignity. Under the poor laws, it was here that the poorest of the poor, the widow, the orphan, the elderly, and the unemployed, came to survive. Yet to survive meant to accept a life stripped bare of comfort and compassion. Imagine a cold, gray morning in London in the 1840s. A woman with 3 children in tow stands before the high gates of a parish workhouse. Her husband, once a laborer, has died of cholera, and there is no money left for food or rent. There are no friends or relatives who can take her in. The workhouse is her only option. At the gate, a clerk records her name, age, and circumstances. She is asked to prove she is truly destitute, to show that she has nothing left. Then, in a cruel stroke, she and her children are separated. Husbands and wives, mothers and sons, siblings, all were divided upon entry. Families were rarely allowed to live together. The poor law believed hardship was a deterrent. If conditions were too bearable, people might seek the workhouse unnecessarily. The woman's children are led away to the boys' ward and girls' ward, while she is placed in the women's quarters. Tears are common at the gate, but the rules are unyielding. Food in the workhouse was deliberately plain. The diet was designed not to starve, but to discourage. Breakfast might be thin porridge or gruel, accompanied by bread so hard it dulled teeth. At midday, a ladle of watery broth with chunks of potato or turnip, occasionally a scrap of meat. Supper was often bread and cheese, or more gruel. No spices, no tea, no sugar. Luxuries were banned. Meals were eaten in silence, under the watchful eyes of supervisors. Talking was forbidden. The clatter of spoons was the only sound. For the elderly who remembered better days, or children who once begged scraps on the street, the endless monotony of gruel was both physically draining and spiritually crushing. Life inside the workhouse was governed by strict discipline. Bells rang to mark the hours. The day began early, often around 5:30 in the morning. Beds had to be made with military precision. Prayers were compulsory. Every movement was regulated. Residents marched to meals in single file. They could not linger or converse freely. In many workhouses, even eye contact with members of the opposite sex was punished. Overseers enforced silence, obedience, and order, not out of cruelty alone, but because the poor law aimed to make the workhouse less eligible than the lowest paid labor outside its walls. In other words, life in the workhouse had to be harsher than life outside, or else the poor would flock to it. The workhouse was not a place of idleness. Men broke stones for road building, picked oakum, teasing old ropes apart with bare hands until their fingers bled, or worked in workshops, making shoes, uniforms, or furniture. Women did laundry, scrubbed floors, or sewed endless seams. Children were put to work too, often sent to apprentice in factories or farms. Many were placed in harsh training schools within the workhouse walls, preparing them for a lifetime of servitude. Work was meant to instill discipline, but often it was deliberately menial, designed to humble, not uplift. The elderly and infirm, too weak for labor, were left to languish in overcrowded wards. The hardest thing about the workhouse was not the porridge, nor even the labor. It was the loss of dignity. To be admitted was to be branded a pauper, a word heavy with shame. Society often saw workhouse residents not as victims of misfortune, but as failures, lazy or immoral. For many, the emotional burden was unbearable. Husbands mourned being separated from wives. Mothers wept for children they could see only at rare intervals. Letters from within the walls often spoke of loneliness more than hunger. And yet, humanity persisted. Mothers whispered comfort to their children during brief encounters. Old men swapped stories when supervisors turned their backs. Songs, laughter, and small rebellions flared up in quiet corners, reminders that even in the bleakest institution, people clung to their identity. Over time, public outrage grew. Journalists and social reformers exposed the harsh conditions of the workhouses. Charles Dickens, in Oliver Twist, immortalized the cruelty of gruel and the indignities of pauper life. Investigations revealed overcrowding, disease, and cruelty, sparking debate in Parliament. Gradually, reforms came. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, conditions began to soften. Workhouses shifted toward being more like public assistance institutions. And eventually, in 1930, the system was officially abolished, replaced by welfare programs that recognized poverty as a social issue rather than a personal failing. The workhouse is remembered today as a grim chapter in British history, a place where poverty met punishment, and survival came at the cost of freedom. Yet it also represents a turning point. Out of its cruelties arose a movement for social reform, one that pushed Britain toward the creation of a welfare state. To step into a workhouse today, preserved in museums across the UK, is to walk through cold, stone corridors, to glimpse narrow iron beds, and to imagine the sound of the morning bell calling paupers to labor. It is to feel both sorrow and admiration. Sorrow for those who suffered, admiration for those who endured. The workhouse was a place where porridge replaced bread, rules replaced choice, and dignity was stripped away. But it was also where the seeds of compassion and reform were sown.